Hey, Tim.
Hey, Matt. Hello, everybody.
We sound like the VeggieTales. Hey, Bob.
Or Bert and Ernie.
Bert and Ernie.
I guess there's a lot of people that don't know who Bert and Ernie are
Okay,
anymore.
so I got to do some housekeeping before we get started.
Housekeep away.
I was told, okay, see, first of all, I think a lot of times that I know how technology and social media is supposed to work, like the best practices. And so when I see people watching on the live, I usually shout them out and hey, thanks for watching. I've been told by several ladies I won't watch it live when y'all are on because you keep saying my name and I don't want to be called out.
Okay.
And so
well, there's a lot of
I won't do that
other
anymore.
YouTube shows, so to speak, that they do that. I don't know.
So if you're out there watching,
we shall improve our etiquette.
If you would comment that you're watching, if you would be so kind, but we won't say your name and draw attention to the fact that you might actually want to learn about Jesus or something. We don't want to do that.
You're assuming they're going to learn about Jesus watching us.
Yeah, I don't know about that. See, I see somebody's watching, but I'm not going to say her name, but you know who you are. Hi. This morning, or is it this morning? I guess today, we're going to jump into the end of 1 Corinthians 11. We're talking about the Lord's Supper a little bit last week in our own special way.
Yeah.
And we'll finish that up talking about self-examination today. We might get into 12. I doubt it. And see, there you go. See,
you can't help yourself.
Well, but Lauren waved at us. I can say Lauren because she waves at us.
Okay.
She waves, so Lauren, we're waving back.
Hello, Lauren.
But even, I guess, before we even jump into 1 Corinthians 11, we're doing a giveaway. I got $120 or $130 worth of retail value. Got a genuine leather Bible and some books and things. And all you got to do is download our app, and you can go to the Google Play Store. You can go to App Store. It's called the Crucibles Fire. Just download it, install it, and then comment on our Facebook page or send us a message or something. Just show us a screenshot where you installed it, and we'll enter you. I don't know how many we've got so far, but we got quite a few. But there's going to be like second and third place drawing. I mean, we're going to give away a bunch of stuff. So we're just trying to get the app out there.
Yeah.
Because that's really kind of how we're trying to, what's the word I'm looking for? To interface. I mean, you can do the Friday Live on there. You can access the podcast by Spotify on there. You can access all of our...
And it works pretty well, too.
Yeah. It's nothing super fancy, which I didn't really want.
It's way different than what it was before, but...
Yeah, and the training's on there. The videos are on there for all of our training, at least the videos that we have. We'll eventually be redoing some of those, but go out there, download the app, and do us a solid there. Anything going on before we jump in?
That's probably relevant. Nothing that we've scheduled or anything like that.
Yeah, well, and actually got a interesting little tidbit. I got an invite for October the 31st. I'll be doing a devotional speaking. I mean, they've asked me to be the guest speaker at a company-wide meeting for Blue Letter Bible.
Oh, yeah.
It's a virtual deal. They have a virtual meeting in like 4 or 5 different states. All of their staff members and volunteers get on a monthly Zoom call. I have no idea how many people that involves, but it's the company-wide for Blue Letter Bible. We're going to share how we use it in the ministry, and they've actually did a write-up on us that's going to come out in their printed newsletter, but it's just not done yet. They'll probably put it out around the time that we speak, and that's in October. So
if you hadn't been to any of our trainings or anything, Blue Letter Bible's a tool that we use to help do word studies and that kind of thing. And Matt's really been working hard with them because we were trying to figure out how to use that in Spanish. And so there's been a lot of back and forth with them and in a good way. And so anyway, this is kind of a result of just working through folks with them and such.
And we'll share that with you if I get a copy of it. I'll share it on the channel, on the YouTube, and I'll share a copy of the Devo if I can get a copy of it. And then the newsletter, I'll send out that too through the app. Shameless plug. So last week in 1 Corinthians 11, we were talking about the Lord's Supper. And again, this is just kind of going along the theme of, if you hear us teach very much, we're always talking about everything's about looking in the face of the Lord. I mean, you just got to go back to looking in God's face. But we as humans, we look for somebody just tell me what to do. Somebody tell me how to do this thing. Somebody give me the do's and the don'ts and I'll be fine. And that's just not how 1 Corinthians reads. We take it that way a lot, but I don't think that that's appropriate. Not that, I'm not saying people are false teaching or whatever. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there's a deeper meaning behind it. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, I think so. And we've talked about a lot. You can read Paul's frustration like he's trying to tell him something and he doesn't know how else to tell him. So he just keeps going. Well,
a lot of what he says in here, because of the fact that he says, well, this is what the Lord said, but this is not what the Lord said. This is just me. He kind of chastises them for even asking the questions sometimes. He's like, you guys have enough. You should be able to answer these questions on your own. And
yeah.
That's really, to me, kind of the crux of all of this is you have the capacity through the Spirit, through who you are in Christ, to answer these questions. And he can say that because a lot of times there's not a definitive yes or no answer.
Well, yes, it is within you. What I don't want you to walk away from here is going, well, that they're telling me that I should know all this and I don't need to, talk to any of my other brothers and sisters or listen to the
no,
not what I mean. And I think it's proven in here, not just in Corinthians, but in other places, that that's how the body works. I mean, Paul was a biblical scholar of the first order before he got saved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what was the guy's name that was scared to death, but God told him to go down and disciple him, basically? It was
Ananias.
Ananias, yeah, not the priest Ananias, but another guy named Ananias. And I bring that up because Ananias just shows up. He's a nobody from nowhere that nobody knows anything about. And just by the conversation that he has with the Spirit, Ananias, he's got some maturity in what we would call the Christian world, dealing with the Spirit and those kind of things and dealing with God. And it's not a hokey, some weird thing that if you've never been around that, you think it was weird. And you never hear of Ananias again. Well, that's my point, is that not only did God send Ananias, but Paul, who was a biblical scholar of the first order and got the Spirit of the Lord in him, still used Ananias to help him start seeing things well and right. That's what I mean by, and that's what he's telling them all through this whole letter is, and that's why I think his attitude could be read, I'm not saying it is, but it could be read like, man, you're being awful condescending to these people. He's not condescending, he's frustrated.
Well, it's really,
because they have the capacity and he can see that.
Yes. It's real similar to me when Jesus is dealing with his disciples and he's like, how long have you been with me? He's like, and it's kind of the same feel of you should be, and that's not to say that if you're walking with the Lord and you're struggling to understand that you should be getting it.
Yeah. They know that's the process.
But John says that eternal life is knowing God. That is the definition of eternal life. It's not stacking a bunch of days together forever, because there is no time in eternity future. It doesn't work. What eternal life is that knowing of God. And so what we're always trying to pull out of these scriptures is the point of it is the struggle, the journey, the getting to know. That really is the point.
Yeah.
It's to look at me, he says, and look at me and get to know me, abide with me, trust me. Quit looking at everything else. And that's kind of what Paul's saying in these passages.
And he's trying to learn them. When I say the frustration, and you should know it, he also understands that you have to grow into that and see it. But it's frustration with him, and he's talked to every level in their church here.
Yeah.
The newly converted, the guys that should be elders. He's talking to all of those levels all at once.
Right.
And you need to remember that when we're talking about this specific conversation. Because again, this is one of those places where we go to and we try to, this is how the Lord's Supper's done. It's not wrong. But he's not talking about the Lord's Supper in an effort. He's coming to another point saying, you're doing these things and you're calling it the Lord's Supper, and it's not. And it's another one of those places where he goes, let me tell you what the Lord told me.
Yeah.
because we talked about this last week. He was not at the Lord's Supper with the disciples,
Right.
but he is a disciple.
He's an apostle.
An apostle. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. And so he just tells them, he says, this is what the Lord told me happened there, and what was transpiring, and what he was trying to get across to his disciples at the time, who are all apostles now.
Right.
And so he makes that dissertation, and you may want to cover that, but I want to get to the end of it.
Yeah, because just real quick, because we have these verses in 1 Corinthians 11. They're 23 through 25, and that's what we read when we do the Lord's Supper. It's appropriate. It's a reminder of what we're doing. But in the context of the passage, in verses like 21 through 22, he's blasting them for the way that they're doing it and calling it the Lord's Supper.
In context with, you say you're with Paul and with Apollos,
Yes.
he's still on this rant.
Yes. And then he says, what he does in 23 to 25 is he's saying, hey, I don't know what you're doing, but what I received from the Lord is what I passed on to you.
Yes.
He's like, I don't know what it is that you're doing over there. Call it what you will, but here's what the Lord gave me, and that's what I gave you, and you're doing something different than what I gave you. And it's not necessarily even a prescriptive, you didn't dot this I or cross this T. It's the spirit of what you're doing, which transmits into the function of what you're doing. Is just you've missed the point. And then that's when he says, here's what I did. They took the cup, he took the bread, and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And verse 7 is a great pivotal verse. He says, so then.
Did you say verse 7?
27.
Oh, you said 7.
I may say, okay, 27. It's a pivotal verse because he's like, okay, what you're doing is weird and funky. You're not doing what I gave you. Here's what I gave you because this is what the Lord told me. So, in light of what the Lord told me is what he's saying in verse 27. Whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sin against the body and blood of the Lord. Now that one is tough.
Yes, it is.
And frankly, that's where a lot of people honestly kind of get weirded out. Like they get scared of the Lord's Supper now. You know, it's like, well, if I don't do it just right, if I hold the cup wrong or what, I mean, I'm being pedantic, but
yeah,
you know, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't want to sin against the Lord. But it's almost like the whole concept of your salvation. You know, it's that old adage, if you're worried about it, you probably don't need to worry about it. Because you're still pursuing, you're looking. And if you care about how you take the communion of the Lord and you want it to be meaningful, you're probably fine. But that's not what they were doing.
Yeah.
You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does.
But the interesting thing for me in this passage is in verse 28. He says, let a person examine himself. Now, you could just read through that and say, oh, okay, no big deal. But Tim brought out a good point before we got on the air. That presupposes the ability to do it.
And I'll tell you how it works with me.
That's all you can do.
There's been a lot of times where I haven't partaken of the Lord's Supper in places where it's been given. Because as I examine myself, I basically come down to a point where I know that I've been pursuing or doing or not acting, or I haven't been doing the kingdom things that I know God is working with me on. And basically I've come to a point, it's not that I've just hadn't done it, but I can confess it, and I know I'm going to go and do it again because I want to. I'm just speaking for me. I'm not talking about everybody else. And it's almost like I know in my head, we talk a lot about God reveals, and that's the place where he doesn't interfere with you. He's looking for you to give up the right to yourself in that point.
Right.
And I'll sit here and confess there's times where I'm like going, I don't want to give that up. And that sounds terrible for somebody who's sitting here doing a show talking about the kingdom all the time. But I'm just telling you, the reality of where I'm at sometimes is I still look at God and I'm going, yeah, I know yours is the best way and the right way, and I see the perfectness of it, but I'm just not interested right now. And I'm not saying that flippantly, like, you know, I can go do whatever I want.
Well, I would even argue that you're probably not walking through that intellectually going, Yes, I don't. It's just that's the reality of where you are in the moment.
Yeah.
If you could speak it out loud.
But in this context, I have come along far enough to where I know that's what's happening, so I don't partake. And I'm not telling you those are the conditions you should or shouldn't take it. I'm just telling you that's where I am when I see that, and I don't do it.
Right.
And it's not an issue of I can't make myself right or any of that. I just know that the wrestling that I'm dealing with at the time, I'm not willing to give myself up to the Lord for whatever that is. Even if I know that I can be forgiven but I'm going to go do it anyway. I mean, it's a willful act.
And there's some tragedy in that, honestly, because what really transpires in that is and you have an understanding of what communion, Lord's Supper, is with the Lord. You're proclaiming his death, you're communing, you're abiding in him in that moment. And the reality of it is in that moment, you're like, I either don't want to or I know I'm not in communion with him. And there's some tragedy in that.
Not in communion with him. And what I'm telling you is those are willful places and times where I'm not, I just don't want to. And don't condemn me, whatever. And I'm not trying to give it as an excuse for anybody else to do it. But I think that's what he's talking about right here. And
Well, let me
yeah, finish that. I'll get ahead of you.
Because there's something in the text that's really germane to that.
Yeah.
He says in the next deal, for whoever eats and drinks without recognizing the body eats and drinks the judgment on themselves.
Yeah.
In Tim's example of not partaking because he knows it's not that he has necessarily even unconfessed sin. It might be that, but that he's just not in a space of wanting to receive the Lord at that point. The act of not partaking is because of the fact that he does recognize the body and the blood of Christ. And he does recognize the importance of what he's doing, so he kind of steps back from it. What this is talking about is those who would, in this context, they were consuming gluttonously, if you would, food and of their own pleasure, not as consuming the Lord's body, but as consuming earthly pleasure and earthly provision.
And there's other sides of that. They were jockeying for position in the church club. And I could even look outside of that and think, well, their culture outside of that was 10 times worse than what we're going through culturally right now. And they're stressed, but they're still living. I hate to use the word fleshly because it's church terminology, but it fits. They're inside the church club. They're fleshly, trying to live in that, jockey for position. Oh, I'm a real Christian. Remember everything was going on. Well, if Apollos was here, he'd be doing it this way, and that's what I'm doing, and that's why you're all messed up. I mean, I think those are the things that were going on when they'd show up to have the Lord's Supper, and on top of all the things he's already been hammering about, and hammering's even a bad way to describe it. He wants these people to grasp the things of the kingdom so that they can, I think this is a big picture of them working out their salvation. And you could say that Paul is a picture of the Spirit going, because after you read all this, if you're really looking for the Lord, I'd feel terrible. And he's almost telling them, well, because God is in there working his salvation out in you, and you people are still trying to hang on to what you want.
Well, and we don't want salvation worked out continually in us. We want it settled, done, and over with so we can get on with it. And that's not how it works.
That's not how God set it up.
And, I was preaching a couple of weeks ago, and I had a really good thought there, and it just left me.
Thank you, Jesus. I don't feel so bad no more.
Left me.
You were preaching at a place because we were talking about Paul. Man, I can't even give you any context.
No, it hit me while you were talking, but this whole idea of when I come to communion, I mean, you talk about how it works for me, and there have been times where I've come to the communion table and I knew that there was some stuff in my heart that wasn't okay, and I was struggling letting it go, bitterness or whatever. And my first inclination was not to partake. But I pushed through that and took it to the Lord in that time, in my prayer time, and was like, hey, Lord, It's not like you don't know about this already, but here it is. Here's what I'm struggling with, and I want to commune with you.
And I think that's righteous.
And I may still
I've been there too.
partake, and I know I'm communing with the Lord. And really, if I could put a scripture to it, I'm sitting there going, I believe, but help my unbelief.
Yeah.
I'm doubting. I'm Elijah going, nobody's left but me. I want to die. And, and yet the Lord's love still comes through in that. He's still inviting you to
Yes.
the table.
Yes.
Um,
And it
but
sounds
what-
like I'm reversing myself here, but no, I've been in those exact same. The point is he's trying to put you in a place where you're looking God in the face, and whatever your condition is, you can let go,
yeah,
or you cannot.
right. Well,
And
and it's about the working through the stuff,
yes,
and we're going to find it in Corinthians later. And everybody wants to talk about God as a God of order. We talk about this all the time.
Well, he is a God of order, but
is.
not the way we would measure it.
Well, but the problem when we get to that passage is we think that whatever our idea of order is, that we can then lay that onto something and go, well, it's obviously of God because it's orderly.
Yes.
That may or may not even be true, but it's not true simply because there's order. And so what I see in this passage is these guys are in there struggling with, how do we make this work? How do we put up to this point, we're going to make our ideas of how church ought to be done. And then we're going to get Apollos' ideas and Paul's ideas. We got to figure out how to do this thing. And they're trying to figure out the formula. And it gets even worse in this text that because they forgot the spirit and the purpose of everything that they were doing in the Lord's Supper. And they just started consuming. And that's what happens when you're crunching and grinding, and you stop doing that, and you just start looking for the formula.
You get tired.
You get tired, and you lose the point. I told Tim, I got a note in the side of my Bible that says, Paul is saying that they were missing the entire point of the supper, very similar to when Jesus flipped the tables in the temple. There was lots of religious activity going down, and everybody was whatever, and there was some wickedness going on too. And that's what ticked him off.
Yeah.
And Paul's frustration comes out in this, where he's like, guys, you're missing the point. The point of the supper, go back, he says, as I received it from the Lord.
And told you.
Or
gave it to you.
Was to proclaim the Lord's death, to recognize the broken body, to recognize the blood and what he did. And the only response you can have when you're doing that, if you're doing that in a good heart manner, is humility and awe.
Yes.
How could he love me when I can't love myself? Nobody, how could he do that? And that's what brings us to, yes, that's right, Patrick. I can say that because he commented. But it strikes me in this passage that he just says, Tim and I talk about this all the time. Examine yourself. As a pastor, I've been a pastor for it'll be 30 years this month. 29 years this month. And people ask me all the stinking time, how do I do this? How do I do that? Fill in the blank. And 9 times out of 10, my answer is going to be, it depends. It just depends. There are some black and whites. Thou shalt nots. Okay, we all know that. But by and large, if we're talking about religious practice and order and stuff, and even the practice of the Lord's Supper, it depends. I've done the Lord's Supper with tortillas and orange juice, because it was what was available.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't unleavened, and that was, ideally it wouldn't. And I'm sorry, but it's probably not necessarily, I'll just say it. They didn't do it with grape juice, okay? And so just because we have a little cup and a styrofoam wafer, that's not, well, if you don't do it that way, if you got the wrong wafer, if that's where you're at, well, their cup was too big, or they did what do they call it in tincture, where I forget the term for it, where you dip instead of have a little cup of your own. If somebody that's watching remembers that term, I think it's tincture. But people get wrapped up around that. And he's going, no. What the point is you need to proclaim the Lord's death, remember his body, remember his blood, and just be with it. and you can examine yourself and figure that out.
And it's interesting that we've taken, well, probably the Protestant religion, I guess, have taken a time of supper where they sat down to commune. This is relevant, but it sounds like it's not. And turned it into a 15 or 20-minute procedure, depending on how many people you have in the room. These guys were coming together to have a meal to celebrate the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord, and they turned it into a party in a bad way. And even when Paul brought this up, remember, he's answering questions of things they brought up.
Right.
But it's like he started on them about, you guys are bickering and doing all this stuff for the wrong idea. And then he gets through that and he gets to a place where he says, okay, so here's some things you asked about that I'm going to have some comment on. And those are some of the ones where he went, the Lord said, and then he said, well, the Lord didn't say this, but here's what I think. And he's in the middle of describing one of those things about being covered or not being covered for the women. They didn't ask about the Lord's Supper. He just goes, oh,
and by
the way, let me tell you, let me add on to the top of this thing that you've been doing, and he hits them with this thing. And I don't want you to, you could almost read this in the way that we're explaining it. You could be going, okay, well, I'm going to learn how to deal with my people by listening to what these guys are telling you. You're missing the whole point if that's what you're looking at this by, right? That's how messed up we can be, being so myopic's not even the word, but two-dimensional maybe. And at any rate, he tells them, okay, it's just another place where I shared with you what the Lord showed me, and you guys are just not paying attention or trying to. And again, remember, he's talking about the new converts. He's talking about the guys that are kind of in the middle of the road. And he's talking about the guys that are elders or should be elders. Because he makes the comments earlier on. I mean, you've been around long enough, you should get this stuff. I mean, he's really hammering those guys. And anyway, so he says, but a man must examine himself, which everything we've been talking about here presupposes the fact that you have that capacity. And we talked about, and I told you I don't want you to walk away from here thinking I shouldn't have all these answers. No, you use the body to work through that stuff. But if your body counsels one thing and they're doing something else, because they might have counseled them, well, this is about the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord, and this is how it works. Yeah, but you're coming in here and pulling the chicken plate away from them and taking a big slug of wine and going, look at me. That doesn't seem to be jiving, so it's confusing, right? We do so many things that are so stupid. But a man must examine himself. So you have the capacity to pursue that, is what he's telling. He's made that point every time since the start of the letter.
Yeah.
And so, and that's what we're talking about, is that you have that, you staring the Lord in the face, something's going to transpire. Help from the outside, or he's going to give it to you and you just don't want to accept that one right then and there, or, you know, whatever it is. But you have that capacity because the Lord does not leave you hanging. He hasn't left me hanging. And I've been in all kinds of capacities where I'm second guessing myself and all kinds of stuff. And as I look back, I can see where he was doing work on things. And I could even say it's maybe twofold. He's helping me work out my salvation, so to speak. And he's doing the supplying, and I'm the one fighting against it. But that's where the turmoil is.
You know, something just came to me that I had a job one time, and I was at Ventone, and making flavors, and I was new at it. And I went to the boss. His name's David. David, you might even be watching somewhere. And I didn't know, I had a problem. I had a flavor I needed to make, and I didn't know how to do it. And I kept coming to him going, what do I need to do? How do I do this? I got a problem, and I don't know how to fix it. And after about the third time of coming back in there, I remember, you know, how he's like, rubbing his eyes, and he said, I put you in charge of the development. He says, if you bring me a problem without a solution, again, I'm going to fire you. And I'll never forgot that. And so even if I came with a bad solution, I came with a solution. I have tried stuff, and it's, you know, here's what I've tried, and it's not working. Now I need help. He just wanted me to have an idea instead of coming in blank. And there's a lot of that spirit I see in
Yeah.
Paul when he says, examine yourselves. What he's saying is stop seeking out for people to tell you what to do before you've sought yourself the Lord's face to see what he wants you to do. Does that make sense?
Oh man, it's perfect. Which brings me to verse 30. For this reason, this is one of those verses that everybody tries to skip or they have some simple opinion for it. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you are dead or have even died. But if we judge ourselves rightly, we would not be judged. So again, we're back in that same step. You evidently have the capacity to judge yourself well. And when he says, for this reason, in the New Living Translation, it says, that is why many of you are weak and sick, and some have even died. Well, that brings a whole nother dimension on top of this thing. And some people run with, oh, well, if I'm not right with God and the Spirit's not right, that's why I'm sick all the time, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we could do a treatise on that, and we could really.
Oh
dig
yeah,
into that.
we could spend forever
but
on that.
Here's kind of you have to. I want to step back and go, okay, but what's he talking about? It's really what we want to do in there is say, if we use the wrong cookie, if we use the wrong, what do we do it just wrong?
That's a simplistic sense.
But what he's getting at is, and remember, the reason that he was having a problem with what they were doing in the first place was because their heart was wrong. They weren't pursuing the Lord. They were pursuing themselves. They were pursuing selfishness. They were pursuing division. And he's like, if you want to pursue the things of the world and call it religion, there's going to be consequences for that from the Lord.
Yes.
So if you want to pursue the man-made teachings of the world, or you want to come up with your own, call it order and godliness because it's orderly and you made it up, I said, go ahead. But you know what? There's a reason some of you are sick and weak and some of you are dead. Because you pursued your own way.
There's a parallel thing to Corinthians here in terms of history and what was going on. So we've said 100 times that the culture in Corinth was way worse than ours is right now. And I know that that's a tension that they're really having to live in, a big one.
Yeah.
So I'm not giving them an out, but in reality, I get that. That's a tough place to be. So the parallel one that's going on here is the book of Hebrews. So in Corinth, I don't know that they were all Gentiles and didn't have church history and all that stuff like the Hebrews, but for the most part, that was probably it. And they're learning, you know, they're probably reading the Torah and stuff in this thing, but that's not natural in their upbringing. In the book of Hebrews, the people he's talking to there have the same culture. I mean, they're living in a bad time. They're getting persecuted and tore up and thrown to the lions. I mean, bad stuff. Way worse than what they're dealing with. But whoever wrote Hebrews, a lot of people say Paul did it. I don't really care who did it, but whoever wrote that to them, he was not easy on them.
Right.
And came at them with the exact same stuff, but even harder, because they knew what the word said.
Right. Right.
So don't come out of this going, oh, well, if these people, somebody I'm leading knows this, if you're talking to an eldership or so, you know, well, my people know all this because I've taught them all this stuff. It means I'm going to come hammering. Well, you need to check yourself a little bit in that regard, but that's a whole nother discussion. But what I'm trying to say is that it's, you're getting the same story from the same movement every time.
Yeah.
So what do I take out of this? I take out of this the fact that we're all susceptible to it.
Yeah, sure.
In everything that we're talking about, and you're not, in the whole directive, even in Hebrews, even though they're bringing up all this stuff that you should be and ought to be and because of and all that stuff. I mean, that's just a way that we have to explain things. They keep trying to shove their face back in the kingdom somewhere that seems relatively arbitrary. And Paul here says, for many of these reasons among you, you're weak and sick and all that. So here's one way of looking at this. They're trying to live in these environments, and at the same time, they take that outside environment, we'll call it the inside environment where the church is. And they're trying to get position because you can say they're scared or they have ambitions or whatever the function is. And they're trying to, because they're telling themselves this is a simplistic function. I do it to myself. Well, if I hold this place and I'm all this and these people see me as this, then maybe that's what I am. But I'm trying to do all that under my own.
Well, in 2 Corinthians 4, he's going to tell them, don't focus on the seen, focus on the unseen.
And that's exactly what they told them in Hebrews.
Yeah.
Say, well, if I didn't have all that, then I could be. Well, maybe that's true, but that's one of the, if God is a God of order, his order obviously isn't what ours is, because in Psalm 50 it tells us that, and where God goes, everything that could ever be created or thought of is tossed straight up in the air into a tempestuous, that's the word that King James uses. It's tempestuous around the Lord. Fire devours before him, and it is tempestuous. That means that things are just stirring up all over the place. And he's not talking about the sinners and unbelievers.
No. What he does is he takes what we consider orderly and tears it up and imposes his will and order on it. It looks different.
So intellectually, that sounds great. And it's right. But when you're trying to figure out the kingdom inside the not kingdom, it gets rough.
Yeah.
Inside your own mind, or at least in me, I'm talking about how I've dealt with this stuff over the years. And it's tempestuous in front of him. Well, what does that mean? That means whoever wrote Hebrews and he's coming and talking to these people that really understand the kingdom. Those people understood the kingdom. They weren't just well versed in the scriptures. Yeah. But yet everything going on outside of them culturally and stuff, they were coming after them. And they were starting to succumb.
Yeah.
And I get it. They just hauled off my son and threw him in with the lions. I can't do this anymore. You see how close that comes? And this guy's telling them, I see it, I feel it, I know what you're saying, and he's probably going through it too at some level, right? But he still comes back into him and he's going, keep facing the Lord.
Yeah.
And we don't want to do that anymore because it gets tempestuous. And we can't even say that we're super oppressed, because we can still stand up in the face of oppression here, and you might get your face slapped or something thrown at you, but that's not really oppression.
Yeah.
We don't want to have to deal with it, but yet we want to be accepted inside of all that and going, oh, look at that. That's why things will work out.
Well, and even back to our text, and we'll land the plane.
Sorry, that was in the text, but it'd take a while to put it back together. Anyway.
Well, and to get back to just close out the Lord's Supper, close out 11, the issue he's dealing with here, and all of that you're talking about, is we want answers. We want answers.
Well, the weak and the sick is what I was getting at. Your own stresses can cause you to have these kind of issues.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, just in blood pressure or all the stuff that makes you weak and sick and puts you out.
Well, and he's saying you're causing a lot of your own problems.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at through that long dissertation. Sorry.
Well, and even so, Psalm 43, is it 46, says, be still and know that I'm God. And some translations say, stop fighting. That's the same picture we have here. He's like, stop fighting yourself and creating all this chaos, and put your face in his face and remember what it is that we're searching for, and that's to know him. That's what we want to know. That's our whole point.
And you may be saying, but I am doing that, but I'm still having this huge struggle, and I don't know how to work through it. So he says in verse 32, but when we are judged, because he's saying if you'll judge yourself right, you're going to save yourself some issues, right? And you have that capacity. But he says in verse 32, but when we are judged, we are disciplined by the Lord so that we will not be condemned among the world. So a lot of that turmoil you're going through, you're seeing that you're not right. And I would tell you that's part of working out your salvation. Yep. And the Lord throws that in there so that you have to be tearing through that, because you're being judged righteously is a kind of a way to look at it.
It's almost like, stop getting judged for the stupid stuff.
No, that's a good way to look at it.
You're getting torn up over the stupid stuff. If you'll judge yourself rightly and stop doing the stupid stuff, when the judgment does come, it's going to be for a reason, it's going to be for a purpose, and over things that matter. And
yes,
and that's a part of the process of sanctification and growing in the Lord.
sanctification's the right word. Yes.
And it's time to go, but as we move into the next chapter, chapter 12 is going to start the spiritual gifts.
Yeah.
We're not spiritual gifts experts, okay? They're not going to have us on Remnant Radio to talk about the gifts of the Spirit, although I would go. But I want to take those things as we prepare. Go read ahead in the context of he's still addressing these issues where they're fighting themselves over what needs to be done in the church. That really is the basis for what he's going to, even addressing the spiritual gifts in this passage. And we're going to approach it from a way not as a checkbox to make sure that our gifts are on point. There is an element to that kind of woven in it, but the bigger picture is how do we get to know and experience the Lord in our walk?
Yeah.
And we're gonna do it from that kind of a standpoint. Couple of things before we go. Share the podcast on Facebook, whether you're doing on YouTube, whatever. Find us on Spotify. Share the podcast with your friend groups or whatever the groups that you're in. We'd love to get a little bit more exposure, and head out there and download and install the app. Let us know that you downloaded and installed it, and we'll put you into the drawing for the Bible and some books and stuff. Like I said, it's over $100 worth of material. We're glad that you guys are on with us today. You got any parting thoughts before we go?
I don't really have many thoughts very often, so.
And aren't we glad?
Aren't we glad?
We love you guys. We'll talk to y'all later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.